The year was 1851, and the plantation along the Mississippi River stood like a silent witness to lives it slowly consumed. At dawn, mist settled over the cotton fields, clinging to the earth as if reluctant to rise. The air carried the smell of damp soil and labor, and beneath that calm surface lay a tension that had nothing to do with the land itself. At the center of it was a young enslaved man known as Elias. Whatever name he had once carried before chains and papers erased it no longer mattered here. On this land, he existed only as a body that worked, obeyed, and endured. Elias had been purchased the previous year by Thomas Whitmore, a man whose wealth and reputation stretched far beyond the plantation's borders. Whitmore was respected by his peers, feared by those beneath him, and convinced of his own moral authority. To him, ownership was not merely legal, it was personal. Every field, every building, every person who labored there reinforced his sense of dominance. Yet from the moment Elias arrived, something about him unsettled that certainty. It was not rebellion or defiance. Elias worked hard, spoke little, and followed orders without hesitation. It was his quiet presence, the way his eyes remained lowered yet alert, that caught Whitmore's attention. At first, Elias worked only in the fields and stables, far from the main house. His days blended into one another, sunrise, labor, exhaustion, sleep. But Whitmore noticed him often, more than he noticed the others. He watched how Elias moved, how he listened, how he absorbed commands without resistance. It felt, to Whitmore, like holding something rare, something unbroken yet aware. That awareness both intrigued and irritated him. The main house stood apart from the fields, elegant and imposing. Inside it lived Margaret Whitmore, Thomas's wife. She had not grown up on plantations. Her youth had been spent in towns where conversation, music, and movement filled the days. Her marriage to Thomas had promised stability and comfort, but it had quietly drained her of warmth. She performed her duties well, hosting guests, managing the household, but inside her something remained painfully unfulfilled. Isolation had become her constant companion. Margaret first saw Elias properly on a quiet afternoon when Thomas ordered him into the house to assist with indoor work. As Elias stepped across the threshold, his presence felt out of place against polished floors and white walls. Margaret glanced up, expecting another faceless servant, and instead found herself looking at a man whose stillness seemed heavy with meaning. She looked away almost immediately, disturbed by her own reaction. Elias was assigned to household duties, fetching water, carrying messages, assisting where needed. His proximity to the Whitmores increased, and with it, the complexity of his existence. But Elias became more than labor. He called him closer than necessary, corrected him more harshly than others, and observed him with an intensity that felt invasive. Control, for Thomas, had always been satisfying, but now it felt intoxicating. For Margaret, Elias's presence disrupted the monotony of her days. She began to notice small details: the sound of his footsteps in the corridor, the way he avoided direct eye contact, the tension in his shoulders when Thomas spoke. She told herself it was nothing more than curiosity, perhaps pity, but at night, when the house fell quiet, Elias's image surfaced uninvited in her thoughts, not as desire in any simple sense, but as a reminder that something in her life was deeply wrong. Elias noticed everything. Silence had trained him to observe rather than speak. He felt Thomas's gaze linger longer than it should, sensed Margaret's hesitation when giving instructions. He did not misunderstand their positions. He knew exactly what he was, property, and yet he also knew that whatever he represented to them was no longer simple. That knowledge frightened him more than any whip or threat. As weeks passed, the unspoken tension thickened. Thomas's mood grew unpredictable. At times he was calm, almost reflective, and at others sharply cruel. He began to summon Elias for reasons that made little sense, only to dismiss him moments later. These interactions were never loud, never openly violent, but they carried a weight that pressed down on Elias's chest. Margaret, meanwhile, struggled against herself. She avoided Elias deliberately, then found reasons to call him back. She felt ashamed of the attention she paid him, angry at the loneliness that had made her vulnerable to it. In Elias, She saw not a man she could claim, but a mirror reflecting her own confinement. That recognition unsettled her deeply. Thomas noticed everything. He noticed Margaret's pauses, her distracted expressions, the way her eyes followed Elias for half a second too long. Jealousy took root. Not the jealousy of a husband fearing loss of affection, but the fury of an owner sensing a threat to control. The idea that something he possessed could pull attention away from him was intolerable. The plantation itself seemed to respond to this shift. Other enslaved workers kept their distance from Elias, sensing danger. Overseers whispered concerns, but Thomas dismissed them. This was his domain, his rules, his consequences. Nights grew heavier. Margaret lay awake beside her husband, feeling the space between them stretch wider than the bed itself. She wondered when she had stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like another carefully maintained possession. Elias, in his quarters, lay exhausted but restless, aware that his very existence had become a silent provocation. By the time autumn approached, the roles between the three had lie changed. Elias was no longer invisible. Margaret was no longer merely lonely. Thomas was no longer merely confident. Each had become aware, painfully, dangerously aware, of the others. What none of them fully understood yet was that awareness, once awakened, could not be undone. It demanded resolution. And on that plantation in 1851, resolution rarely came without ruin. The change did not arrive suddenly. It crept in through routine, through glances that lasted too long and silences that spoke louder than words. By the time winter approached, the plantation no longer felt like a place governed by order, but by unease. Elias sensed it every morning before the first command was given. The air itself felt watchful, as though the land was aware that something fragile was being pushed toward breaking. Thomas Whitmore's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He began finding reasons to keep Elias close, inside the house, near the stables, anywhere his presence could be monitored. Orders were repeated even when carried out correctly. Instructions were delivered with deliberate slowness, as if Thomas were testing how much pressure Elias could withstand without cracking. It was no longer enough that Elias obeyed. Thomas wanted to see submission written into his posture, his breathing, his silence. At the same time, Thomas watched his wife with equal intensity. Margaret had become quieter, her movements more restrained, as if she were constantly aware of being observed. She spoke lesser tea meals, excused herself more often, and spent long hours alone in rooms she rarely used before. Thomas interpreted this withdrawal not as loneliness, but as concealment. Every change fed his suspicion, and suspicion fed his anger. Margaret lived in a constant state of inner conflict. She despised herself for the attention she gave Elias, even when that attention existed only in her thoughts. She had not spoken to him beyond necessity, had not crossed any visible boundary, yet guilt clung to her as if she had committed some unforgivable act. What frightened her most was not Thomas's growing severity, but the realization that Elias represented something she had lost long ago, the sense of being seen as human rather than ornamental. Elias noticed Margaret's struggle even when she avoided him. Her voice sometimes faltered when giving instructions. Her hands trembled slightly when she passed him objects. He never met her eyes, never lingered near her, yet he felt drawn into a conflict he had no power to influence. He understood that whatever passed between Thomas and Margaret would ultimately fall on him. In such systems, it always did. Other enslaved workers sensed the danger and kept their distance. Elias became isolated, not by force, but by fear. No one wanted to be close to someone so clearly marked by the master's attention. The overseer warned him quietly to be careful, though what careful meant in such circumstances was never clear. Elias already knew that caution could not protect him from someone else's obsession. One evening, Thomas summoned Elias to his study. The room was dim, heavy with the smell of leather and ink. Thomas questioned him about trivial matters, chores, schedules, obedience, yet the questions felt like traps rather than inquiries. Elias answered calmly, head bowed, voice steady. The calm irritated Thomas. He wanted fear. He wanted proof that Elias understood exactly how precarious his position was. After dismissing him, Thomas sat alone, replaying the interaction in his mind. Elias's composure felt like a challenge, even though it was nothing of the sort. To Thomas, it seemed impossible that a man who owned nothing could maintain such restraint. That restraint became evidence in his twisted reasoning of hidden intentions. Margaret noticed the aftermath of these encounters. Elias returned from them quieter, more withdrawn. The small signs of exhaustion deepened, slower movements, hollow eyes. She wanted to ask what Thomas had said, what he had done, but she knew that asking would only draw more attention, more danger. Her silence became both a shield and a betrayal. The tension finally surfaced openly one afternoon when Thomas observed Margaret speaking to Elias in the corridor. The exchange was brief, harmless, an instruction about household linens, but the proximity, the lowered voices, ignited something volatile in him. He said nothing at the time. Instead, he smiled politely and later ensured Elias was assigned to the most punishing tasks available. Margaret watched this unfold with growing dread. She understood the cause, even if Thomas never named it. Guilt turned into quiet panic. She tried to distance herself further, but distance only sharpened Thomas's focus. Her attempts at restraint were interpreted as confirmation that something was being hidden. For Elias, the physical labor intensified. Long hours, heavier loads, less rest. The punishment was subtle enough to avoid scrutiny, but relentless enough to wear him down. Thomas needed him exhausted, weakened, reminded of his place. Control was no longer symbolic, it had become punitive. Yet punishment did not bring Thomas peace. The more he asserted dominance, the more unsettled he became. He watched Margaret closely, noting every breath, every pause, every moment of distraction. He spoke to her with thinly veiled accusations, framing them as concerns or jokes. Margaret endured it quietly, knowing that any defense would escalate the situation. At night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, aware that her life had narrowed into a series of calculated silences. She wondered when obedience had replaced partnership in her marriage, when fear had replaced affection. In Elias, she saw the extreme version of her own confinement. The difference was that she had once been free. Elias, too, lay awake at night, his body aching, his thoughts restless. He considered escape, but he knew the land too well to believe in easy freedom. The plantation was surrounded not just by fields, but by laws and men who enforced them. Still, the thought lingered, not as a plan, but as a quiet refusal to accept that this was all life could be. The conflict between Thomas and Margaret reached a breaking point not through confrontation, but through certainty. Thomas became convinced, without proof, without confession, that something existed between them that humiliated him. That belief hardened into resolve. If control could not be maintained quietly, it would be enforced visibly. Margaret sensed the shift. Thomas's voice became colder, his decisions sharper. She feared what he might do, not only to Elias, but to himself, to her, to everything he owned. The obsession that had once been subtle was now shaping every choice. Elias felt it too. He had become the center of a struggle he neither desired nor could escape. The plantation that once consumed his labor now consumed his very presence. Whatever came next, he knew, would not be survivable in the same way. Something irreversible was approaching. And on that plantation, when obsession reached its peak, it rarely ended quietly. The final shift began not with violence, but with certainty. Thomas Whitmore no longer questioned his suspicions, he accepted them as truth. In his mind, truth did not require evidence, only conviction. Once that conviction settled, every action he took felt justified. The plantation was his, the people on it were his, and order had to be preserved at any cost. What he did not recognize was that order had already slipped beyond his control. Thomas's demeanor grew eerily calm. The anger that once flared unpredictably now burned beneath the surface, controlled and deliberate. This calm unsettled Margaret far more than his earlier outbursts. She sensed that a decision had been made, though she did not yet know its shape. Conversations between them became formal, almost distant. as though Thomas had withdrawn into a private space where she was no longer welcome. Elias noticed the change as well. The punishment stopped abruptly, replaced by something colder, distance. He was reassigned to work far from the main house, in remote sections of the plantation where supervision was minimal but isolation was absolute. The message was unmistakable. He was being removed, not for his actions, but for what he symbolized. Elias understood this as both a reprieve and a warning. Being forgotten could be safer than being watched, but it could also mean he would disappear without notice. Margaret learned of Elias's reassignment after the decision had already been enforced. When she questioned Thomas carefully, choosing her words with precision, his response was calm but final. He spoke of efficiency, of necessity, of propriety. Beneath his composed tone was a challenge, an unspoken dare for her to object openly. Margaret recognized it and retreated, but the retreat came at a cost. For the first time, she felt something inside her break. Days passed in strained silence. Elias labored in the distant fields, his body weakening under the strain, his mind dulled by exhaustion. Yet the physical distance did not erase the conflict. It lingered, unresolved, feeding on resentment and regret. Thomas found no relief in Elias's absence. Margaret found no peace in her compliance. Obsession, once ignited, does not extinguish easily. The breaking point arrived through misunderstanding rather than truth. A careless remark from an overseer, an overheard fragment of conversation, was enough to confirm Thomas's worst assumptions. He no longer differentiated between suspicion and fact. The narrative in his mind was complete, and it demanded resolution. Thomas ordered Elias brought back to the main grounds under the pretense of discipline. The tone of the command alarmed those who heard it. Even the overseer hesitated, sensing that this was no ordinary correction. Word spread quietly, carried through glances and silences. Something irreversible was unfolding. When Margaret learned what Thomas intended, restraint abandoned her. She confronted him directly, not with accusation, but with fear. She spoke of consequences, of excess, of humanity. Her voice shook, but her meaning was unmistakable. It was the first time she had openly challenged his authority. Thomas listened without interruption. When she finished, he did not raise his voice. Instead, he looked at her with something close to disbelief. In that moment, he realized that he had already lost her, not to Elias, but to her own awakening. That realization hurt him more deeply than jealousy ever had. The punishment Thomas intended was halted before it reached its worst form. The intervention of others, driven less by compassion than by concern for order, forced his hand. Elias was spared the full extent of Thomas's wrath, but the damage was already done. The physical pain faded slowly, the psychological wounds did not. Elias survived, but survival came stripped of hope. Whatever strength had once allowed him to endure with quiet dignity was now replaced by emptiness. He moved through his days mechanically, no longer observing, no longer expecting. The world had made its rules clear, and resistance, silent or otherwise, had proven futile. Margaret changed in ways Thomas could not undo. She withdrew completely, no longer performing the role of devoted wife. She fulfilled her duties with precision, but without warmth. The house became colder, quieter. Thomas found himself surrounded by the very silence he had once enforced on others. The plantation began to decline. Productivity dropped. Tensions among workers increased. Thomas's reputation suffered as whispers traveled beyond his control. The authority he valued above all else began to erode, not through rebellion, but through isolation. Power requires recognition to exist, and he was losing it. Within a year, the plantation was sold. The decision was framed as practical, but it was an admission of defeat. Thomas relocated, seeking distance from the land that had exposed his weakness. Margaret went with him, though the marriage had become a hollow arrangement sustained by habit alone. Elias was transferred to a new owner. His circumstances did not improve, but they changed. The specific triangle that had defined his suffering dissolved, replaced by a more familiar, impersonal cruelty. In its own way, that anonymity was a relief. The weight of being seen too closely was gone. Years later, the plantation stood abandoned, reclaimed slowly by nature. Those who passed by spoke of it as a place where something had gone wrong, not through scandal or crime, but through obsession unchecked by conscience. 3 lives had intersected there, each constrained by different chains, each undone in their own way. Thomas lost the illusion of absolute control. Margaret lost the comfort of ignorance. Elias lost what little faith he had in endurance without consequence. None of them emerged unmarked. The story left behind no heroes, only a warning. When power confuses possession with humanity, when silence is mistaken for consent, and when obsession replaces restraint, destruction follows, not loudly, but inevitably. And that, more than any single act, was the true tragedy of what unfolded in 1851.